Dear members of Parliament, colleagues and partners, welcome to our webinar discussion on Building Back Better, Lessons from COVID-19 Pandemic to Enhance the Role of Parliamentarian in Disaster Risk Reduction. My name is Paola Brito. I'm the Chief of the Intergovernmental Processes, Interagency Cooperation and Partnership Branch at UNDRR, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Before we start, I would like to note that this webinar will last 75 minutes. All attendees are muted by default. If you have a question you would like to ask any of the panelists, please submit it through the Q&A feature, not the chat box. The COVID-19 pandemic has been far more than a health crisis. It has impacted societies at their core on multiple levels. The pandemic's economic consequences are expected to be especially devastating, deepening poverty and inequalities across different regions and potentially derailing efforts to achieve the SDGs. The World Bank forecasts a 5.2% contraction in the global GDP in 2020, which makes the COVID-19 crisis the deepest global recession in decades. As a result, understandably, policymakers are under pressure to loosen restriction and support various sectors to return to the pre-disaster conditions. However, once the immediate health crisis is over, countries must not revert back to business as usual, with practices that increases emissions, degrades the environment, and increases disaster risks. Doing so would be a loss and a missed opportunity. Indeed, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, in his message on the International Day of Parliamentarism, has urged national parliaments to play their full part in advancing sustainable, inclusive responses to COVID-19. Those of us in the disaster risk reduction field recognize the important role parliamentarians play in disaster risk reduction through legislative oversight and budgetary action. Yes, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown that preparedness for a pandemic was not adequate. But we have an opportunity to change this now, as we are nearing the Sendai Framework Target E deadline for countries to develop national and local disaster risk reduction strategy, closely linked with development, climate, and financing frameworks. Parliamentarians have a key role in the developments of the required legal framework. We therefore call on you to use this influence to consider introducing a number of changes to your law and regulations that not only lessens the likelihood of another disasters of this magnitude, but it also applies a long-term prevention approach to build and revise economic, social, and financial system to be risk-informed, and as such, avoid the creation of new risks. Key among these changes is the strengthening of your risk governance. Specifically, ensuring that your national disaster risk reduction strategy are comprehensive of all hazards, whether they be climate-related, environmental, man-made, or biological. The success of these plans will depend on your ability to fund their implementation, and more importantly, to incentivize cooperation among relevant ministries to ensure a truly whole-of-government approach. To help you address this complex but critical topic, UNDRR is working with IPU in developing a toolkit to guide and assist parliamentarians in their efforts to initiate, strengthen, and oversee national and subnational development and investments towards disaster risk reduction legislation. This toolkit will include lessons learned from COVID-19 crisis, and it will be informed by the discussion in this webinar. I would like to extend my thanks to our distinguished panelists and to our two co-organizers, the Interparliamentary Union and the World Health Organization, for helping organizing today's discussion. But without any further ado, I would like to start by first welcoming my colleague, Dr. Richard John Brennan. He's the Regional Emergency Director, Eastern Mediterranean Regional Office in the World Health Organization. Dr. Brennan coordinates WHO technical and operational support to 22 countries for emergency preparedness and response. Currently, he oversees the organization response to the COVID-19 pandemic across the region. Dr. Brennan, over to you for your introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, Paola, and greetings, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I really am honoured to open this second UNDRR IPU WHO webinar that recognises the vital roles of parliaments and parliamentarians in reducing the risks of all types of health emergencies and disasters, including COVID-19. These webinars are another example in pandemic-related collaboration among parliamentarians, the disaster risk reduction community, and the health sector, as well as many other stakeholders. I offer my thanks to UNDRR, the IPU, and WHO colleagues for their organisation of the webinar, and also thank our presenters and participants for joining us here today. WHO works closely with the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction in our offices across the world, including here in Cairo, Egypt, where our Eastern Mediterranean office is based. In the past few months, we have scaled up our collaboration with countries and partners in COVID preparedness and response to reduce the health and broader socio-economic impacts of the pandemic. This webinar is also the result of WHO's long-standing collaboration with the Interparliamentary Union on Global Health Security, which is one of the 3 priority areas of the joint WHO-IPU Memorandum of Understanding. The Eastern Mediterranean region, which I represent, has also strengthened engagement with national parliaments in the region by launching the Regional Parliamentary Forum for Health and Wellbeing in June 19, and that particular forum is going from strength to strength. As we all know, unfortunately, this pandemic is far from over, and today's webinar provides us with the opportunity to reflect on the absolutely vital role of political leadership and the whole of government approach in effectively responding to a pandemic or any other major health crisis. And associated with that in this regard, the countries that have been most successful in tackling the pandemic so far have all had a number of similar characteristics. They've all demonstrated strong governmental leadership, established cooperation across the political spectrum, secured synergy among different sectors, and avoided politicization of the crisis as far as possible. In doing so, they have engaged all relevant governmental ministries and departments, acted on the advice of public health experts, developed and adjusted their response plans based on scientific evidence, and demonstrated solidarity and compassion for all population groups, especially the most vulnerable communities. And strong political leadership is needed not only for responding to pandemics, it is also crucial for the comprehensive management of any large-scale risk, emergency, or disaster through all phases of what we call the emergency management cycle, including prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery. Across the world, countries and communities face a wide range of interconnected risks and emergencies. Here in the Eastern Mediterranean region, the COVID pandemic is taking place against a background of widespread and large-scale humanitarian need. 12 of the 22 countries in this region are experiencing some form of violent conflict, and the region is home to 43% of those in need of humanitarian assistance globally. We're also the source of around 64% of the world's refugees. But it's not only conflict and complex emergencies that this region is prone to. We are also vulnerable to disasters from natural hazards and recurring disease outbreaks, including cholera, dengue, measles, and MERS, which is caused by another coronavirus. Managing all these risks is clearly very complex, and multiple stakeholders need to come together in a true whole of society approach for, again, managing the prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery of these emergencies. And please don't underestimate your roles as parliamentarians in these processes. Whether your key functions in representation, legislation, accountability oversight, budget allocation and advocacy, you have a unique and incredibly important role and influence in the management of emergencies. This includes establishing and strengthening effective governance, policy frameworks, and multi-sectoral coordination mechanisms that are inclusive of all the relevant stakeholders. These functions are also important for investing in stronger health and related systems, including transport, education and animal health, and others, which provide critical functions before, during, and after emergencies. And to avoid the repeated cycle of panic and neglect associated with emergency response, we need to invest in comprehensive emergency management capacities across all sectors and across all those 4 phases of the emergency management cycle that I've mentioned a couple of times already. And such investments will hopefully break this panic and neglect cycle to better protect health, economies, and societies as a whole. With the COVID pandemic, we've also observed the value of clear communication when government leaders are sharing common messages with their citizens. And conversely, the problems that arise when these messages are inconsistent or incorrect. Clear and timely messaging is key to effective community engagement and protection during the time of emergencies. In essence, if we look across many of the large-scale emergencies to which we have collectively responded in recent years, going back to the Ebola outbreak in West Africa back in 2014, more recently Ebola in DRC, of course the pandemic today, and many of the other large-scale natural and humanitarian emergencies. 2 of the most important lessons that we've learned is the central role of government leadership and of effective community engagement. Now, to perform your functions properly, parliamentarians must be informed and involved. And opportunities like today's webinar and the ongoing collaboration with the IPU play a critical role in this regard. As I've indicated, there are many lessons that are being learned and relearned during this pandemic. Many of these lessons are captured already in 2 very important documents: the WHO Health Emergency and Disaster Risk Management Framework and the WHO Multi-Sectoral Preparedness Coordination Framework. And I would recommend both those documents to you. Each of them emphasizes the all-hazard risk management approach across government and across all sectors and levels of society for effective emergency management. And as part of strengthening country capacities for emergencies, there will be many opportunities at national and subnational levels to institutionalize these lessons and good practice in the overall national health and disaster risk management systems. Once again, the effective leadership of parliamentarians will be critical to ensure that we work together to respond to COVID and to strengthen disaster risk management capacities in general, including the very important focus on emergency preparedness to ensure that we are ready for a timely and effective response in the future. These lessons will also inform the development of a handbook by IPU that I think Paula mentioned before, and WHO that supports parliamentary actions to strengthen health security and inform guidance by the UN systems through UNDRR in collaboration with WHO and other agencies. So once again, it's a great pleasure for me to join you for this webinar, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing the presentations from our speakers today and the subsequent discussion. Thanks again.
Dr. Brennan, thank you very much for setting the floor and for putting forward how successful political leadership in responding to the pandemic looks like. Very much appreciated. I would like now to pass the floor to our second speaker. It's Mr. Saber Chouhouri, Honorary President of the Interparliamentary Union, Member of the Parliament in Bangladesh, and a UNDRR champion for disaster risk reduction in Asia and Pacific. Mr. Chouhouri, in your experience in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, how can we shift from an approach centered on responding to emergency to efforts that are focused on the prevention of risks? And also, what steps can Parliament take to ensure a holistic approach is adopted to disaster risk management? The floor is yours. Mr. Chuhuri, you're muted.
Okay. Okay, I've done that. Can you hear me? Yes.
Very well.
Great pleasure to be here and speak to fellow parliamentarians from across the world. I've seen people have signed in from the Caribbean, from Argentina, also from the Middle East. So I won't say good morning or good afternoon or good evening. I'll just say that I hope your day has been good and it will be good as we go through. Let me just first say a few things based on what Richard was just speaking about and the question that you have asked me. I suspect that my answer and that of the discussion of the other panelists, as well as the questions from the participants, it's really all of these will refer to the Sendai framework. Richard referred to two documents from the WHO. I know there are the Bangkok Principles. So the reason why I refer to Sendai is back in 2015, it actually identified epidemics, it identified biological risks. And unfortunately, I think what has happened is the world has focused on natural hazards. And in the process, we have forgotten this very important dimension of risk. And Sendai, as we know, is all about preventing new risk and reducing existing ones, so minimizing them. And so I think if we look at the Sendai document, and there is another reason why I think it is important, because of all of the major global processes of 2015. So we had Sendai in March, we had the climate change agreement, we had the sustainable development goals, we had the Addis Ababa financing. Of all of these processes and the documents, only Sendai specifically refers to the role of parliamentarians and parliaments in terms of strengthening national legislative frameworks. I had the honor to be there, and Alexandra from the IPU, who is also with us, was also with me in Sendai. And I think we as parliamentarians really push for that. Unfortunately, you know, when we talk about role of parliamentarians, and I'm going to be very candid because, you know, this is an event for parliamentarians, we have not really held our governments to account in terms of what they have done about Sendai. Because Sendai clearly mentions all of these things. And whether it is a resilient health system, how that integrates with disaster management, whether it is risk governance, all of these are actually mentioned in the Sendai document. So I would encourage all of my fellow parliamentarians who have joined today to have a look at the document. The other aspect that becomes very clear, and if I talk about my own country, Bangladesh, you know, as we are fighting COVID, infections are still on the rise. We have had almost 175,000 people who have been infected. The numbers are going up, over 2,200 people who have died. So our health system is really being pushed to the brink. I think we have done well in terms of medicinal health, you know, looking after an individual patient, but we have not fared as well when it comes to public health, where of course the focus is on prevention, and that links to Sendai and what we are trying to do. And as we tackle COVID, because the monsoon season has started, we just negotiated a super cyclone, Amphan, and people.
Dr. Chuduri, we cannot hear you. It appears like we have lost the connection with Dr. Chuduri. Yes, I think we will have to allow for Mr. Chuduri to connect. Certainly very much appreciated his overview in terms of, first of all, providing value to the Sendai framework itself, that has allowed for different stakeholders, including parliamentarians, to find themselves fit in order to actively join the disaster risk reduction agenda, but also to put forward the relevance of the multi-hazards approach. So with this consideration and with this technical challenge that we're currently facing, I would suggest to move over to our next speaker. And of course, we will give the floor back to Mr. Chuduri once the connection is re-established. So I would like now to introduce Ms. Bernadette Boyata Songa, member of the Parliament of Sierra Leone and a member of the IPU Standing Committee on Sustainable Development. Ms. Leone is facing background. All of you, thank you. Ms. Songa.
Oh, hello. Hello, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm not sure if you can hear me clearly. You're breaking up on my side.
Okay. I hope
you can hear me.
To hear me. I'm going to be repeating the question to you.
Please.
Sierra Leone is facing the COVID-19 pandemic as well as other disaster risks such as flooding due to the rainy season. How can disaster management be improved to ensure effective response to multiple disasters happening simultaneously? And what role can the Parliament play in this process?
Thank you very much. I bring you greetings from Sierra Leone. Freetown is the capital city of Sierra Leone, and Freetown is surrounded by the peninsula by mountains, huge mountains in the peninsula, which have been known in the previous years as having a densely forested area all surrounded in the capital city. And in the past, we've had so many beautiful animals residing in those forests and its surrounding. But recently, this peninsula have suffered a massive destruction of deforestation, which have led to mudslides and so many other disasters in the country as a whole. The seriousness on its environment, places like Matoma, Tombo, Regent, Grafton have experienced landslides, floods, and all the rest due to issues like this. In Sierra Leone, we have different types of hazards, climatic hazards, geological hazards, social hazards, epidemic hazards, and human-induced hazards. The flood is one of it. Usually, we have flood of streams in the forest that flow down into the capital city of Freetown. But due to the deforestation, the main supplier of water supply in Sierra Leone, which is the Guma Valley, have suffered a lot of issues in supplying the capital city with water. Issues like this have been contributed mainly, as I said, by deforestation. Sand mining is another issue that we face in the country. The coastal areas among the destructive factors, such as Crew Bay, Susan's Bay, Success, have all been affected by sand mining. Human activities, which includes projects like building houses to accommodate people to live around those areas, have been some of the factors also that have persisted, that have contributed to persistent mudslides happening year after year in Sierra Leone. The soil have been exposed to territorial heavy downpours that erodes the earth's surface, leading to mudslides. They have also been exposed to the probability for mudslides and flooding to happen in the rainy season, with a high risk for mostly slum communities. Therefore, there is a high need to support and mitigate this growing trend in environmental degradation and increase in poverty and malnutrition in the country of Sierra Leone, especially in the western area of Sierra Leone. The emergence and preventiveness of the COVID-19 globally have led to so many economic factors that affect the country again. As I have said previously, mudslides have affected thousands of lives, and properties have been destroyed, especially in the Freetown capital city. And because of this, it has led to a lot of poverty in the community and malnutrition to young children as a risk factor to the country itself. Now, what have the Sierra Leone government done? We have done a strategy, a disaster management strategy that have looked at 6 factors. The first one, we looked at implementing risk identification, assessment, and surveillance and multiple hazard early warning systems across the country as a whole. We also looked at coordinating and monitoring robust preparation and mitigation activities for priority hazards. We've looked at coordinating both response planning and execution planning across MDAs and partners for priority hazards and locations. We've looked at strengthening the capacity of the DMD department's training, new staff, and embedding new processes. The governments have looked at strengthening ability of the key MDAs to run a tactical response with training and simulations programs for priority hazards. The governments have looked at implementing robust data and information management system and use data for decision making as a way of putting mechanisms in place to manage. In the strategy planning as a country, we've looked at pillar engagement, the engagements as a pillar structural device. We've looked at the protection and psychological pillar in terms of the strategy implementation. We've looked at the health and barriers pillar. We've looked at the logistics pillar, security and safety pillar, social mobilization and communications pillar, food assistance and nutrition pillar, coordination pillar, WASH pillar, registration pillar, and technical pillars. Now, as a members of parliament in the Sierra Leone Parliament, we have looked at what we can do as parliamentarians to assist the government in ensuring that these disasters and risk in the country as a whole are managed. We have looked at developing and amending legislative policies to enable disaster management structures to operate easily in the country, especially the COVID-19 pandemic that we currently have in the country. We've looked at responding to issues raised by constituents in regards to disaster management by referring to the different structures put in place by the government. We've also looked at what we can do to our constituents as parliamentarians. We've looked at as a parliament that it's probably necessary to go down to our constituencies while we're working from home, because since the COVID-19, we haven't been having effective parliament sittings. And so we are mostly working from our constituency offices. And if we are doing so, we have looked at ways that we can mitigate issues of disaster management by looking at how we can sensitize our communities, sensitizing them about the implications of cutting down trees, deforestation. Because what happens, people are using this as livelihood for cutting down for timbers and things like that. In order for them to understand the risk involved, we need to go down to their level to educate them and sensitize them about the risk involved and what we can suffer as a country, as a government, and as a nation. We've also looked at implementing the tree planting initiative that was launched by the government. We can probably decentralize these whole activities into our constituencies, because the city have commenced tree planting. So it's a process of where you cut down one tree, you plant another tree, because we've looked at mudslides and disaster management. So encouraging our constituents to do tree planting will be one of the mitigating factors that can assist us as a country. We've also looked at the strict disciplinary measures using the councils. The local councils can be used. As parliamentarians, we are seen as role models, but we cannot operate in our constituencies without the council. So we've looked at how we can involve the council into our sensitization as a nation, into our different constituencies. And we've also looked at providing facilities for the proper disposal of sewages. Now, especially in the city, most of our sewages are blocked. People are dumping wastages into the sewages, which if we have a heavy rainfall in the city, there is no drainage. It leads to overflowing and flooding into the city itself. We have also experienced issues like that in the districts and the local areas in the constituencies as well. So we've been looking at how we can strengthen the sewage, how we can look at our drainage system to ensure it's fit for purpose, but also avoid such incidents happening in the society. We've also looked at undertaking tree planting exercises into our schools. The children have to be taught, the young ones have to be taught in schools as to the importance of tree plantings and what the mitigating factors can be in future if we are to have hazards of flooding and disasters in the country. What can we do to manage it? We've also looked at engaging community stakeholders, which can be involved in the tree plantings and the sensitization to our people in general. Now, in the process of this, we've got roles that organizations play in the country to manage the risk disaster in the country. And some of the things we've highlighted that they can help with as organizations is the training of people in our country to understand disaster management as a whole and how we can manage the risk factors of it. And that can be then decentralized into the constituencies and the local councils. We've looked at support in terms of equipment. We've looked at humanitarian support, technical cooperation, resource mobilization, assessment and data collection, logistics supports like transportation, medical assistance, awareness raising, as I've earlier said, and education to our constituents. Now, in doing so as a parliament, we are more than prepared to go down to our constituencies, but this needs to be discussed at national level as to our involvement as parliamentarians into the disaster risk management. How do we do it? Where do we start as a nation? Where do we start as parliamentarians? What would be our involvement and what would be the expectations of our people? This needs to be further discussed in the House of Parliament for us to better understand the roles in ensuring that these disasters are well managed. We have the ONS in our country, which is a security factor that looks at disasters in the whole country. We have engaged them as a parliament to see how we can collaboratively work together to ensure we go down to the people that needs to understand what is happening. But first of all, we as a parliament needs to understand what this disaster does to the nation, the economic factors, and the human nature itself, and the developmental structures that the country needs to undergo if these disasters are mitigated appropriately. So we have looked at, as a parliament representing the IPU, that we probably need to have a workshop for the parliamentarians to understand what we can do and what we need to do as a nation, as parliament, for us to march forward into the community to educate our people. Thank you.
Ms. Songa, thank you very much for this comprehensive overview, putting forward the considerations relating to the disaster management plan, but also the role of the parliamentarian and the way ahead in order to face it. Very much appreciated.
Thank you.
I see that now Mr. Chuduri is back with us. Mr. Chuduri, we lost you at around your 5th minute of intervention. I will have to give you the floor back. Thank you.
Okay, I'll be very brief. Sorry I lost you all there. Technical issues which we didn't foresee. I was talking about the monsoon season and the fact that we have just negotiated cyclone Amphan, super cyclone. And, you know, we moved a lot of people to the cyclone shelters. We saved a lot of lives. But the point that I'm trying to make there is, you know, we in the past tended to look at hazards in isolation. There'll be one hazard now, there'll be one in 2 or 3 months' time. But now I think the new normal after COVID actually tells us that we have to negotiate multi-hazards. So our preparedness also has to be from a multi-perspective. So that's where the holistic approach is needed. Specifically in terms of legislation, I think, you know, we have looked at legislation in the past. A lot of the laws that we have in our in various parts of the world refer to them as disaster risk reduction laws, but they really still talk about disaster management because the focus has not shifted to managing risk rather than managing disasters. So I think now we have to look at how we bring in the biological aspects. You know, how do we bring pandemics into it? So I think their parliamentarians have a very special role to play. Very quickly, if I can move on to financing, which is also one of our responsibilities. And it's not just a question of allocating resources. It's a question about smart investment. If we look at what is the benefit of action and what is the cost of inaction, this is a wise investment that we make. Anything that we spend today is going to be far less than what we may have to spend tomorrow. So I think parliamentarians have a responsibility to ensure that the government funding is judicious, it is prudent. Where do I get the maximum impact from the money that I spend? So I think these are all very important. And the biggest overriding issue, of course, is governance, you know, risk governance. Because if you look at the risk drivers, you know, if you understand risk, you analyze risk. Okay, so you say poverty is a risk, where you're living, if you're living in a coastal area or somewhere else, that is a risk. But I think one of the major risks that we have is bad risk governance. So I think how can we improve governance? How can we reflect on what has worked well, what could work better, and what has not worked at all? I think governance is not about what we do, it is about how we do what we are trying to do. So I think their parliamentarians have a major role. And finally, the point I would like to leave with all of the parliamentarians is, you know, when we think of our role, I've always believed that we have three powers. You know, I call them the three Ps. One is the power of the purse, because we allocate the resources that the government spends. I mean, through the budgetary process, we give legitimacy to that. You know, we actually approve the budgets. The second P that we have power over is policy. How are our policies aligned with the international commitments that we have made? I think that is also very, very important. You know, how can we allocate resources to building back better, which is not just about trying to recover, it is also about bouncing back. I think building back better, not just in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of policy, in terms of governance, in terms of thinking out of the box. And the third power that I refer to, the third P, is the power of pronouncements. You know, someone mentioned about communication. What we as parliamentarians say in the public domain makes a difference. So let us as parliamentarians leverage the power of the three Ps, as I call it, and try and make a difference when it comes to COVID and the post-COVID period. Because remember, all of the losses that we have incurred over the past 20 years, economic terms, in terms of human casualties, in terms of people displaced, just one COVID has in fact caused far greater loss than all of that. So the pandemic is the new normal. We have viruses jumping from the animal kingdom into our society. You know, how do we man that border? We get obsessed about building walls between countries, but we don't think about how we are going to protect the border between the viral world and our real world. I think I've taken more than I should have. I'll be glad to answer questions. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chuduri. A very comprehensive presentation. I already summed up your first part of the presentation. In the second part, I would very much appreciated your capacity to project something that turns into very practical activities and reflection for a long-term sustainability at the national level through the engagement of the Parliament and the parliamentarian. I would now like to turn to Ms. Ana Belén Marín. She's a member of the National Assembly in Ecuador and the president of the Executive Committee of the Pan-American Parliamentarian Network on Climate Change. Ms. Marín, also thank you very much for making yourself available at such early time in the morning. So, based on your experience, how can parliamentarians brokerage the integration of health-related issues such as biological hazards, into the disaster risk reduction policies and the development processes? Also, how can parliamentarians promote national disaster risk reduction strategies that are covering all hazards and are aligned with national health plans? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paola. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, first, I want to mainly thank the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, Regional Office for the Americas and the Caribbean. Then receive a fraternal greeting for the National Assembly of Ecuador, an entity to which I belong, and I'm honored to represent in this dialogue on the lessons and the COVID-19 leaves us. in order to implement improvements in the Parliament through disaster risk reduction. To answer the question posed, that is, how we parliamentarians should promote strategies and development of disaster risk reduction policies, I have divided into 4 points or spaces for analysis. First, all countries should have a management laws risks that clearly include risk prevention and each of the protocols to follow in the event of a risk, be it natural or anthropic. In this regard, I must point that in November 2017, I presented to the National Assembly of Ecuador the draft organic law of the risk management system, whose objective is to define the structure, competence, and operation of the law from a comprehensive approach that includes prevention, response, and recovery from natural, social-natural, or anthropogenic risk and disasters. In the face of the global crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, I reaffirm the urgent need to implement a specific regulation related to disaster risk reduction, not only due to the great impact on public policy. This is why I must be considered as a cornerstone for territorial planning and political decision-making, because today, more than ever, we can ensure that a risk law can save lives, develop countries, and build sustainable cities. For these reasons, it is time that globally and comprehensively we have this type of regulation. We must build regulations that strengthen the health sector as a fundamental axis of a country's social development. Second is prioritizations in the use and delivery of resources. Each state, each nation of the entire world is under the obligation to prioritize the delivery of resources, not only to tackle the economic and social effects that the pandemic has produced, which have been many of incalculable dimensions of specialized for the underdeveloped countries like Ecuador, but in the public policies for scientific research and development. In the general state budget, infrastructure, and scientific research must be prioritized. The specific and the specialized training for medical personnel must be guaranteed, allowing quality and care and warmth for the population. Third, education. Education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world, to say Nelson Mandela. So, despite the crisis and the incalculable economic losses that it has generated from our parliamentary work, we must monitor that the rights related to access to education are respected. Under no circumstances shall we endorse the reduction of the budgets established in the different areas of knowledge. Investments in universities shall be encouraged so that the cost of the specialized are not so high, promotion of scholarship and exchanges, recognition of international degrees, etc. That they do not become the main limitation for young people to access these careers, limitations that have become a low number of specialized in branches such as epidemiology, allergology, or neurosurgery. Fourth, for me, it's super important, this number, because it's around the supervisory role. This is the function of a legislator covered 2 areas: the legislation, of which we have already spoken, and of inspection, a role of notable importance as it focuses on verifying that for all levels of the state, intervention strategies are completed with due to and with their necessary inputs and reduce the possibility of contagion, the treatment and recovery of the sick, and economic recovery. In this particular case, in the face of the several corruption scandals that, unfortunately, my country has experienced, I have made public my audit management by requesting information from the levels of governments of my province, as well as the different hospital centers in the sector, to verify that the resources destined to face the emergency have not been diverted, to verify that if there is any indication of corruption, it is immediately sanctioned with the maximum rigor of the law. Because with the people, with the pain of the people, it is not played. Before, during, and after this pandemic, I should be monitored if the state's resources are being invested appropriately, in addition to verifying that all the resources that come from other countries, either as donation or credit, are used effectively in affected and highly vulnerable areas. There are no limits to fulfill our duty. It is the function and obligation of each one of us, as representatives elected by the vote of the people, to realize the rights of the people. Health, protection, and security are rights that we must do to the extent impossible to specify. Thank you.
Ms. Morin, thank you very much again for your comprehensive overview. Very interesting reflection on regulations on DRR and how the different sectors, including the science, the budget, the education considerations, needs to be kept in mind. And of course, your very interesting considerations related to the monitoring of figures in terms of the implementation. I would like now turn to our final speaker, Mr. Andreas Griffroy. He's the Senator of Belgium and Rapporteur to the IPU Standing Committee on Sustainable Development. Senator, as countries begin to loosen their lockdowns, governments are being urged to use the crisis to accelerate moves towards a lower carbon world. Given the scale of the economic damage created by COVID-19 and the prospect of mass unemployment, what can parliamentarians do to turn the situation into an opportunity and revive their stricken economies through new policies to promote a green economic recovery? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good day to everyone around the world. According to this concept note, the aim of this webinar is to present parliamentary experience from different countries of managing the COVID-19 pandemic and the implications for developing and implementing disaster risk reduction strategies. For obvious reasons, the managing part has largely been fulfilled by the governments. As Western countries, we haven't had to manage a pandemic for almost a century. We didn't know exactly what was coming. We have tried to be prepared and to manage this crisis properly, but we have to admit that we haven't always been successful. And during the peak of the pandemic, our parliamentary heart was bleeding, as we had to accept special powers from governments, emergency legislations, and so on. Our governments also had to rely strongly on the advice from experts to the level of accepting a large-scale lockdown of our economies and societies. We have to ask ourselves to which extent parliamentary democracy can be put on hold in the future. Nevertheless, in this particular situation, it was the only way for our governments to act quickly enough to protect our citizens and our economies. But speed and crisis management often mean making mistakes, facing rusty systems, which are stuck in old patterns and even discovering important dysfunctions. And in my view, this is the point where parliamentarians have to step in and play a crucial role in building resilience. In the first place, they have to monitor whether sufficient strategic stocks of protective equipment and diagnostic tests are available, and whether flawless contact tracing strategies are ready to use, not only now, to counter an eventual second wave, but also when this pandemic will hopefully be a distant memory. However, the role of MPs can and needs to go far beyond this. We talk a lot about the new normal because we are in the middle of a disruptive evolution during which almost anything can and must be questioned. Which kind of globalization do we want in the future? What kind of economy recovery we want in the future? How do we guarantee sustainability in the process? How do we invest in the climate change against the background of a global economic crisis? The parliamentary response to this crisis will have to be a long, in-depth assessment based on hearings with national and international experts in order to guarantee that the new normal will have a democratic basis and that it will be compliant with our SDG reference framework, which can guide us through this disruption. In a certain way, parliamentary democracy itself has improved as a whole series of subjects have become more debatable than before. In several countries, a debate is going on about investing in healthcare and healthcare workers, despite budgetary constraints. Discussions about the Green Deal in Europe, discussions about the green economy for the future. And lots of government services and private companies finally start to realize that a lot of work can be done, for example, from home. Even the work now of our parliament. We are voting on distance and not in real life in the house of the parliament. In order to regain a healthy and resilient economic system, we will inevitably need traditional short-term recovery measures to strengthen solvency and ensure liquidity, and we will have to stimulate the demand side through targeted investments. And regional production will have to be strengthened by paying particular attention to strategic products and services. And I would like to underline, however, that education, training, research, innovation, jobs, and efficient government are the best guarantee for proper prosperity in the long run. They remain the best long-term investments. On top of these challenges, we are facing a major disruption. I want to go through to two important elements of it. Firstly, any future disaster risk reduction strategy will be big data driven. Parliaments will have to discuss this indispensable tool thoroughly, and they have a huge responsibility in ensuring that data policies are efficient, balanced, proportionate, and compliant with international standards and privacy rules. Nevertheless, we shouldn't squander the huge potential social, economic, and ecological benefits from a smart digitalization. And this brings me to the second element of the disruption that I want to highlight, as we will have to embed the ecological challenges in the economic recovery. I would like to start that with an initial warning. We have to watch out for the most vulnerable people. They should not be the victims of an accelerated ecological transition. The main risk is that much needed social compensating measures will be overlooked. Furthermore, as politicians from the Western countries, we don't only have to consider the most vulnerable persons in our own countries, but also about the people in developing countries. If we want to realize an ecological transition, we need to have everyone on board. And this means that there must be a North-South solidarity in order to fully seize the opportunities of this crisis. Having said that, the crisis is a perfect opportunity to invest in energy efficiency, electricity networks, climate-friendly mobility infrastructure, the circular economy, and so on. And to avoid any misunderstanding, I'm not only talking about direct investments from our government. A lot of companies came and will come knocking on our door and ask for support. And then it will be crucial to invest in the sectors of the future that can and will assure productivity growth and which are cost efficient and beneficial for the government and its citizens and the climate and the world. This means also that our choices will have to be as climate friendly as possible. When it comes to large loans and Russian operations, lenders can not only look at the company's financial results, but they can also take social and environmental criteria and good governance into account before making a financing decision. It goes without saying, dear colleagues, that making the right innovative choices will not be easy, but I am convicted that we will draw a lot of inspiration from this and future platforms. And coming to this framework that we needed, that's now our job. That's what MPs have to do and can do in the future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Senator, for a very comprehensive way of describing what it means, the new normal, what it means looking therefore into big data drivers, into data policy, ecological challenges, but also to ensure that we keep this consideration in mind as we're going to be moving forward. Dear participants, it is now the moment to ask questions to our panelists and to kick off the discussion. We don't have a full 20 minutes, but we will certainly move straight ahead with some of the questions that we have received. It's going to be difficult to capture the spirit and the richness of the questions, but I would like to start with the question that we have received related to lessons learned. What are the lessons learned from COVID-19 about amendments of existing law to meet future urgent needs in similar situation? For this, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Chuduri and then Ms. Marin. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paula. I think I addressed that very briefly in my comments, the second part of my comments, where I said we have to relook at legislation. In fact, the Sendai framework also refers to the role of parliamentarians in terms of how we can strengthen legislative frameworks. So I think we have to now make sure that the legislation we have covers all of the hazards. Not just natural hazards which become disasters because we have not been able to manage them. I will also say that there is no such term as natural disasters. A disaster is not natural, a hazard is natural, and it becomes a disaster when we don't have the means, when we don't have the responses, and we don't have the resources to respond to it. So I think looking at legislation, making sure that biological risks are covered, making sure that pandemics are covered, how can we strengthen the linkages with health? I think that is very important. Health, of course, is also an overarching theme of the Sustainable Development Goals in terms of SDG 3, and it's also referred to in the Sendai document. So I think that's how we bring that in. And maybe the handbook that IPU is talking about, I know that when I was in Lao PDR, we had looked at model legislation. And what we tried to do there was, rather than coming up with the legislation and the exact wording, we tried to identify what would be the main components of that legislation. And I think that was very effective. So maybe in the handbook that the IPU and the UNDRR and WHO is putting together, just identify what sort of elements or what component should be part of the new legislation that we are looking at. And I think it also gives us a chance to address the issue of identifying risk. I think in a lot of the legislation in many countries, including Bangladesh, I'm sorry to say, doesn't address the issue of risk. The legislation might be disaster risk reduction, but in effect, it is still disaster management. So we also need to make that mindset change when we are relooking at legislation.
Thank you very much. Ms. Marin?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think everyone must be empowered, and the way to do it is with knowledge, because disaster policy does not wait. It's time to update and create new initiatives from the hand of the society. In Ecuador, we start to work in this policy, but around the world, you have a lot of policy, but it's so important to update that policy and create new initiatives from the hands of the society. That's important. No just work in your office. It's important work with the people, with the society. That's this next is the best important work with the people.
Thank you very much for this. We also received a question for Senator Gifori. You mentioned about the European Green Deal. How do you see the role of this deal in addressing the reduction of both natural and human induced? And Is it time now for all countries to have a dedicated risk reduction strategy in all European countries? Senator, the floor is yours.
Well, I've seen that there are some questions about this topic. Just to be clear, the Green Deal is announced already, I would say in October, November 2019, and is a pathway to come to a climate neutral Europe in 2050. But it's not only about energy, it's also about transport, it's also about circular economy, it's also about economy and green economy, etc. So what I mentioned in my keynote is that for the exit strategy, how you have to relance your economy, you cannot say only to companies and to people, to citizens, I give you some helicopter money. And this means that you give everyone some money because they ask it, but that you first look to what is your future? Your first question about economic strategy in the future is, what do you want? What kind of economy you want? And for us, this economy has to be a green one. And so then you can say, if the government is supporting the economy by money, that you can say, we have some conditions on that. And these conditions are based on the Green Deal. So the Green Deal where you say, okay, we go to climate neutral Europe against 2050. So we ask, for example, when an aircraft company like Lufthansa or other companies or Air France is coming to have some billions of euros support, that we can say, okay, maybe we can do that, but what about your kerosene that you're using? What about your efficiency of your airplanes, etc., etc., etc. So that that's our job as a parliament, that we say, no, we don't give the money just like this. Because of this pandemic, in this exit strategy, we have some conditions that we are asking about climate-friendly and green-friendly support. That's what I, in fact, want to mention. And of course, there's no direct link between this Green Deal and pandemic and the disaster debate. Of course, when you go to the more climate-neutral Europe in the next decades, of course, then you have less possibly disaster. But for me, it's very important that you it's not condition-free when you support now the economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We also received a question for Dr. Brennan from WHO. What should be the role of WHO in protecting vulnerable groups, children, women, older person, and person with disability? Dr. Brennan, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Paula. Thanks for the question. Well, experience has shown that different types of emergencies and disasters affect different segments of the population in different ways. There are certainly groups that are more prone, more at risk to the consequences of emergencies. And classically, in most emergencies, we worry about the particular vulnerabilities of groups such as women and children, the elderly, the disabled, in certain instances, certain minority groups, ethnic groups. With health emergencies specifically, such as disease outbreaks, WHO has a really important role to really determine who the most at-risk groups are. And of course, we've been doing that with the COVID outbreak. And as you're aware, the analysis has demonstrated, not only by WHO, but by governments and our partners, demonstrates that the population groups that are most at risk from the disease are with other diseases, what we call comorbidities, such as cardiovascular respiratory disease. So in that instance, given those findings, WHO it provides technical guidance and policy guidance for lessening, reducing the risk of those groups. So, and that translates into very concrete measures. For example, we know that elder care homes or nursing homes can be sites of real amplification of the outbreak. So we actually have to put in protective measures in those kind of contexts. We have to put in protective measures for the elderly more broadly. We need to identify people with comorbidities, track them early to pick up the disease early in those groups so they can receive treatment more rapidly. But we're also looking at the risks of other groups. We know there are, such as pregnant women, and trying to learn more about how COVID may affect those groups. We've picked up a couple of, while children are not as at risk of as other groups, we do know that they are, in rare instances, developing a new, severe inflammatory condition. So even though children don't get sick as often and as severely, we do know that there is a risk for severe disease, albeit small. So we need to take the disease in them very seriously. So, in essence, our role is to identify the at-risk groups, to advise on protective measures and public health measures to reduce that risk and to reduce the impact of the disease on those groups.
Thank you very much. And time is really coming short, but we have received a question for Ms. Songa. Ms. Songa, COVID-19 has really shown the value of local actors as first responders. What do you think parliamentarians could do to enhance meaningful participation of local actors in policy makings?
Thank you very much. In order for us to involve local actors, we have to look as parliamentarians into how we can sensitize and educate the country as a whole, the local actors, the community, and also encourage community participation for us to have their ideas, their own knowledge of and understanding of what the policy is about, what their contributions will be, and taking that on board while discussing the policy, and look at how we can incorporate that into the policy making. So it's basically educating them, going down to sensitize people about the policy making, and listening to their own side of what they think it should be and what should happen. That way, it will be an everyone in and no one out situation where they will feel part of the whole process from beginning to the end.
Thank you very much, Ms. Songa. We have finished this interactive session, but of course there will be the opportunity for all of you to receive feedback to your questions offline. We have over 500 participants, so we can understand the richness in expectations and putting forward the questions. Now, what we have seen emerging during our discussion is that not every disaster is a pandemic, but every pandemic is a disaster. Therefore, simply seeking a return to business as usual, where risks are ignored, puts the world in danger, and increases the risk of disaster. So we must recover better and build back better with a view on protection and on building long-term resilience. Because the nature of risk has changed, countries need to adopt an approach that is systemic, is joined up and addresses cascading effect. Without that, one risk can transform into another, exposing and exacerbating existing vulnerability. We must fight systemic risk with a systemic approach, so we can no longer work in silos. And clearly, parliamentarians play a key role in bringing about this shift in thinking from protection to prevention and sustainability. So I would like to pass the floor now to Dr. Brennan for his final reflections before the closing of the seminar. Dr. Brennan, the floor is yours.
Thanks again, Paolo. Excellencies, it's been a terrific discussion. I wish it seems to have come to a close fast participants, to think that there's so much interest in this particular topic that 500 parliamentarians and colleagues from around the world have joined is really exceptional, and speaks to the importance of this topic. So, from across the world, we've heard from our colleagues. We've heard about many common challenges that countries face, and more importantly, the progress that is being made. We also see the need for each country to develop or adapt measures that target their specific local risks. Parliamentarians are playing a dynamic role in COVID-19 preparedness response and helping to guide adaptations in the national response as the outbreak evolves, and we learn more about this very interesting and sometimes elusive virus. Very importantly, we've also discussed how an all hazards disaster risk management approach and disaster risk management measures are being applied to the prevention, the preparedness, response, and recovery from this pandemic, and all of this is key to ensuring community and country resilience, health security, and ultimately sustainable development. You as parliamentarians have a crucial role, as we've discussed, in institutionalizing the lessons learned and strengthening the country systems for managing all types of emergencies, including epidemics, and the closer integration of biological hazards in national and local strategies for disaster risk reduction, as per Target E within the Sendai framework. And those of us who were in Sendai, we all remember how important a breakthrough it was to have infectious hazards and have the international health regulations included in that incredibly important document. I really cannot overstate how critical your leadership role is, now more than ever, for effective disaster risk management and health security, and to ensure the health, safety, and prosperity of all countries now and in the future. I would also like to thank our webinar organisers, colleagues and friends from the Interparliamentary Union, UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, once again for this very timely initiative, and I hope and expect and believe a fruitful initiative. So once again, thank you all for your participation, and have a great morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brennan. And at the closing of this webinar, let me extend my thanks to our distinguished panelists, you two, and the two co-organizers, of course, the Interparliamentary Union and the World Health Organization. Thank you for your time, commitment, and continuous efforts to make this world a safer, healthier, and a more resilient place. As I already mentioned, I would like to inform you that the organizer will try to respond to the remaining questions after the webinar by posting the answer in this event page. Goodbye, everyone. Remain safe and continue to be engaged.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye. Please.
I'm meeting.